This lecture is to review the background information and terms required for the picture of Dorian Gray, our next work of literature. We're moving now from short stories into the novel. Okay, so honors English 4 students read the Victorian novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Victorian period refers to the years between 1837 and 1901. This would be during Queen Victoria's reign. The era is named after her. So we're actually moving backwards in time now. We were just in the modern period. So the Victorian era is actually the time period just before the modern period, which we just covered. So the Victorian era was a different, older time period from the literature we just covered. It is characterized by English imperialism. So during this time, England was rapidly expanding around the globe. Queen Victoria was named Empress of India. The Victorians were spreading the empire. They were increasing trade and travel. It was a time of great expansion. The Victorian era is also thought to be a time of rigid morals and repressed sexuality. Most of the writers that we read from this time period would have been almost writing in code. So sexuality is often not addressed directly in literature. It's usually done through symbolism or allegory of some kind. Reading became a new pastime because some theater was regarded as immoral. Always, theater has been problematic because it involves people getting up and very often acting out sin. So when we cover Shakespeare, for instance, we will see characters murdering each other, characters bathing in blood, witches communing with the devil, casting spells. It's a terrible amount of sin that gets represented on stage. And for that reason, dating way before the Victorian period, theater has always been a little bit suspicious. So reading for the Victorians was seemingly a safer experience of art. Homosexuality as a lifestyle or as behavior was regarded as criminal during this time period. And that's very important because Oscar Wilde was sentenced to homosexual activities and died in poverty, disgraced. So his books very often and plays have themes of homosexuality, but again, they would have had to been written about in a coded, indirect way. So we will definitely come back to this topic with Oscar Wilde, but it is important just as background for his work. Okay, so the 19th century novel, this is the time period where the novel is reaching its heyday. It becomes the leading form of literature, and this is often regarded as the high point of this art form. So we're talking about lengthy works of prose. Prose means not poetry. Okay, and the novel, obviously, that's a long version of a work of prose. No longer, we're not talking about the short story anymore. We're talking about the novel. So the novel becomes popular during this time period, mainly because of two things. We now have a population that is literate enough to have access to the written word. So they're no longer relying solely on storytelling and the oral tradition to pass down fiction. Before this time period, poetry was more popular because it could be recited or sung and performed. So that was really a part of the oral tradition. Now we have a large enough population that can read, so they have access to the written word. We also have the printing press. And novels during this time period were usually sold chapter by chapter, very cheaply in the form of newspapers. So you didn't have to be rich enough to afford an expensively bound book. You could simply, for a few pennies, buy one chapter at a time. And that is why, especially for Charles Dickens, one of the most famous Victorian novelists, the chapters end in cliffhangers because they definitely wanted you to buy the next chapter. So they oftentimes left you almost like an episode of a really good TV show that we would watch today with a cliffhanger that would keep you binging on that same story. Famous Victorian writers include the Bronte sisters, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories. Obviously, I mentioned Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair, which some of you might have heard of. Oscar Wilde, of course, and Lewis Carroll, the writer of Through the Looking Glass, the Alice in Wonderland story. Okay. Victorian novels tend to focus on the difficult lives of characters. And this is especially true with Charles Dickens, who wrote about children who were up against a very difficult adult world, the plight of the poor and the working class. And there's an idealized notion that hard work and perseverance and a strong moral fiber will win out in the end. So this follows the belief that virtue is rewarded and wrongdoers are punished. In fact, the term Dickensian ending means that the good guys win and the bad guys get punished. Do not use the bus to ride home. Please remain in your classroom until the bell rings. Again, if you're marked as a bus student and do not use the bus to ride home, please remain in your classroom until the bell rings. Gothic literature is an example of fantastic fiction. So these are characters that are larger than life, like Sherlock Holmes, and had exotic enemies to defeat. Other Gothic characters include Dracula and the Invisible Man, both famous, fantastic characters. And they combine elements of romance and horror. And the purpose of Gothic fiction is to thrill and terrify the reader. Gothic literature often includes monsters, ghosts, the supernatural. Even Sherlock Holmes is a Gothic character because Sherlock has abilities to see minute details and solve crimes that almost seem supernatural. Gothic fiction usually set in castles or monasteries or cemeteries. The setting kind of mirrors the inner turmoil of the characters. If there's a great storm or a flash of lightning, that might happen at a very important plot point. So the picture of Dorian Gray is a mix of a lot of popular genres during this time period. As a Victorian novel, though, it certainly contains the elements of Gothic fiction, as well as good versus evil and comedies of manners, which were also popular genres at the time. Okay, so again, emphasis on the power of imagination and the supernatural, presenting a taste for the mysterious and the macabre. Nature parallels action and experience, horror, death, and the gruesome or supernatural. And character motivations often stem from evil or a darkness within. All right, for Oscar Wilde, he was born in Dublin, Ireland. He's actually of Irish descent, but he embodies the concept of art for art's sake because he made himself into a work of art. He took on the personality of British Victorian upper class elite, even though he was far from that. He fashioned himself as a dandy and kind of managed to perform and talk his way into those social circles. So he was really made himself into a work of art in addition to being a writer and a poet. Okay, so terms, aestheticism. Beauty has intrinsic value. Art does not have to be a means of enforcing a moral code. Wilde's ideas were revolutionary in Victorian England.